Hello and welcome to today's live broadcast. We are live with one of our title sponsors, Roots Collaborative. We're excited to talk to them. We're excited to talk about how they support the entire family through recovery. But just in case you haven't heard, A Way Out is going digital for our 2020 conference this year. A Way Out has thrown an in-person event for years in the past that has great topics, great speakers, but due to COVID restrictions, we are going digital for the 2020 conference. We have 3 internationally renowned speakers lined up, Dr. Michael Barnes, Dr. Judith Grissel, and Roquel Lerner to talk about improving outcomes from addiction. This is a 3-day event, 12 p.m. to 1:30 each day, September 29th, September 30th, and the 1st with a panel discussion on the 1st with all of our speakers. But without further ado, I would love to invite to the broadcast today the Roots Collaborative. Hello and welcome to the broadcast today. My name is Danny Colella and we are live with 2 of the owners of the Roots Collaborative. If you are a family member, a loved one of somebody suffering through the illness of addiction or drug abuse, and you don't know where to turn and you can't quite get the support for the entire family, then we have 2 people who are very qualified to talk to you about that today, because not only have they gone through, or not only are they in recovery themselves, but they also have a daughter in recovery. So they've dealt with this at a very high level in their own family. So Clay, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, what you do, and who the Roots Collaborative serves?
Thanks, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to be part of this today. Yeah, Roots Collaborative, we formed this company for what we needed to be served when we went through either a parent needing to find their way into recovery or our very own daughter who works with us, and she's currently 22. As we know, the illness of substance abuse, alcoholism, eating disorders, it can be pervasive, and we understand now that through the generations, it can show up in different coping skills that affects the family as a whole. And we work with families in crisis. We get that call where they're like, hey, we have a very challenged individual. That could be mom, dad, son, daughter, grandparents. And we plug in to help support that family as a whole network to heal as a family, which helps the individual who's currently struggling find their own path to recovery. And we support the whole family network. Julie?
Yeah, I think that's well said. As Clay said, usually a paradigm could be that somebody calls and their person is in crisis, whatever that might be, because for every family it's different. And they'll want us to perhaps come in and help that individual get into a treatment center or some sort of level of recovery. And a more typical situation would be that that person would go to recovery, stay the 30 days, 45 days, whatever it might be, and then come back to the family and all would be well again. And as Clay said, that was not our experience as young people who got sober. I got sober when I was 20 years old. I have come from a family of alcoholism, depression, suicide, eating disorders, you name it. We probably have it in our family. And I had a couple of an aunt and an uncle who had gotten sober prior. And so when I first heard about the illness of alcoholism, I called them non-drinking alcoholics. And so what I've learned since then is that, it takes a lot of support, even after you go through a treatment center, to be moving in a healthy direction. And so all these years later, when Clay and I have our own daughter and she starts running into some challenges with an eating disorder and then addiction, we're thinking, well, what happened? We're sober. She's never seen either of us use. And how is this going on? And I think that is where we as sober parents started to have different aha moments about how we needed to be supported, as well as how once we got through this journey, we could support other families.
That's great. So just to highlight some of the key things here, you are a 3-member team, wife, husband, daughter. You guys are the team that is set something up that really exposes where, when you went through this, you were confused. You couldn't find the right way to do things. You were lost. So essentially, you've set up this infrastructure that's designed by parents, and now Courtney, who's a daughter, to help this entire family unit through this. And this just isn't like typically going to treatment. You guys are not a treatment center. You guys are a team of interventionists and a team of family support that's going to get that client, that person suffering with addiction, to the right resources. So if you're going to pick up, or you're going to go to the Google and type in drug treatment, you're going to get a lot of options. How do you know where to start? Well, why don't you start with 2 parents who know what might be good for your daughter, who you know might be good for your son, who know what might be good for your husband or your wife, whatever it might be. So I think that's pretty awesome that you guys have kind of designed this business to work by families for families. That's a big deal. I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
So when we talk about things that are a little different about you, and the reason you came up with this name, Roots Collaborative, and we have some roots in the background, is you're interested in serving the whole family. Talk about why serving the entire family is so important.
Do you want to kick that off, Julie?
Sure. Well, we like to use the analogy of, if you imagine, like, the image in the background, this really big tree that has very deep roots that probably hasn't moved for hundreds and hundreds of years. And you send a little twig at the top of the tree to treatment. And then when that twig comes back from treatment and you reattach it to the tree, do you think that twig is going to change this 100-year-old root system? Probably not.
I would guess not. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think what we know to be true through research and evidence-based, we went through and got trained in something called ARISE, which is founded by Dr. Judith Landau. And it fits very well with our ideology. And what she suggests and the research supports is that if the whole family heals together, and each person is of equal value in the recovery process, the original person of concern, who is the reason why our phone rang, if they all work together in recovery, the sustainability for that original person of concern in their recovery goes up exponentially. Right. And so that's what we're really doing, is we're changing old patterns, we're changing, past trauma, grief, things that have been handed down through the generations that are coping mechanisms, or, a trauma that no one had the tools to heal from originally. We have those tools today. And so what that does is it creates freedom for everybody to let go and move forward with new coping mechanisms. And it's such a miracle to be part of and watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and coping mechanisms mean something happened to you. You had a bad week, you've been going down in depression or whatever's been happening, and at the end of the day, you pick something up, a drug or a substance, and you feel better. And that works for a while, really well, until it doesn't. And that's where we, Clay, what I want you to talk about, because that was a great answer, Julie. Clay, I want you to talk about the biggest myth in treatment. When we talk about that twig analogy, what about this idea to a parent that's thinking, okay, I'm going to send my son or daughter to Clay and Julie. They're going to fix them and send them back. What would you say to that parent?
Well, for us, and from personal experience and then also professional training, we very well know that individual, if it's an adolescent, where Julie and I both found ourselves in treatment at a very young age, we went back to our nucleus. I was still living at home the first time I went to treatment. And I was looked at through a particular lens, like everything was okay now and everything could go back to normal. Unfortunately, there were challenges that led to the substances being a coping skill, meaning within my family and within my home, there was stuff I couldn't articulate. And I couldn't understand. I have this perfect environment, great schools, you know, athletics. Why was I raging against the machine? And come to find out through the studies and just being in recovery for a very long time, understanding that I'm not the identified patient. There were challenges within my family. My grandfather was an epic alcoholic, you know, and so throughout the generations, there have been folks that have suffered with the illness. And for me, returning home, I did feel like the identified patient. All eyes were on me to perform. Well, I already was challenged with the idea of having to perform in a certain narrative. So it made it very stressful and challenging as a young person. So what Julie was speaking to as far as, you know, the whole network. And when we say network, we mean the folks that are invited. It's an invitational intervention that we create. And so we're not popping out of the closet. We're not doing those sort of things. What we're doing is everybody knows we're coming. We want as many people to be invited to it. Aunts, uncles, cousins, you know, of course, siblings, parents, because those are the people that are going to help support recovery for the person of concern, the identified, challenged person at the moment. And so we need those people to help support that individual in their journey to recovery. And so we do these family Zoom calls for, we hope, for 6 months, weekly, and we follow a very specific protocol.
Yeah.
Check-ins, how you doing? Recovery commitments. Did you check out? And we're not prescribing these. It's very organic for the family members to start to educate themselves. We do pop, you know, education for them, understanding the illness and how epigenetics works as far as damaging from previous generations cellularly. And so, I stumble with that word. And understanding how everybody has a part for their own healing. And it just creates a beautiful moment for everybody to discover their own journey for recovery. Now, whether that's plugging into a 12-step community like Al-Anon or codependency meetings, reading books. Some people start to practice yoga and meditation. It's just health and well-being. And people find their own recovery commitments throughout the weeks of this journey as a family as a whole. And that connectivity and real-time communication, no shame, blame, or guilt. We are making sure that that language is not used in helping each other communicate effectively, loving and compassionately, and being accountable to that. So that's what we're working towards and we're creating. And so that's the system, that root that we're trying to heal from previous generational trauma.
Yeah, and that's great. And the one thing you started to bring up was this ARISE intervention model. So if you stick around, we're going to talk about how, not only do they help families through the recovery process, but they also assist in this intervention process. Now, most of us have seen this very popular show on A&E TV called Intervention. And we're going to clearly talk about how the model that they use at Roots Collaborative differs from what you may have seen on TV. And you're going to be surprised. It's way different. But before we get there, Julie, I want to talk about, we're going to talk about bridging that gap. A lot of the times when families come to you, things aren't healthy. They've argued. Moms and dads may have been stolen from. Trust has been lost. A lot of damage has been done. And it's so important for you when we talked about bridging that gap, educating these individuals on what's going on in their life so that they can get back to normal. Talk about how you bridge that gap between, the addict and the family, and how education is so important for that process.
Well, that brings up a really good point. In our society, I think addiction and alcoholism and other disorders are so misunderstood. And so people have a really hard time separating the illness from the person. And so one of the first places we start is helping families to understand if your loved one had a choice, they would not be behaving this way. But it's like these illnesses sort of hijack the person whom we love. And the process of the invitation, and as Clay so eloquently said, we invite as many people as possible to this initial first meeting. And at that meeting, we begin that educational process where we set family strengths. So we ask families, what makes you awesome? I mean, you're here today. Is it love, loyalty, resilience, hard work? And they tell us, and we write it down. And then we'll ask them, we'll spend a good, usually an hour to 2 hours doing a family genogram where people talk about how their ancestors came to the United States, the journeys that they went through. Some people talk about stillbirth. Some people talk about the loneliness. Other people have coping mechanisms like gambling, sex addiction. I mean, all of these really rich stories that no one has been talking about in a sincere way. I mean, lots of people have like the crazy uncle jokes and, oh, you could have met great grandfather who had like a gun rack. I mean, really like outlandish stories that become lore. But when you put it up in front of everybody, the magnitude of that history is astounding. And then what that invites is the person who's in crisis. They start out like this, thinking that they're going to get sort of attacked for being in the illness and in those behaviors. And then what they see when they think both mom and dad's generational stories come down, and they're like, and we say, you come upon your challenges honestly. And where do we want to go from here? And then at that point, we do a family recovery message, which is very much like a mission statement for a business. It's like, here's where we want to go. And then that becomes the defining piece over the next 6 months of work, that we align behaviors. Are things bringing us closer to that, or are things bringing us farther away? And so to your point, the bridging the gap for us is that we're following people like a Sherpa over a series of maybe treatment centers, therapists, counselors, IOP, which is intensive outpatient program. And then maybe somebody goes to sober living. And so you've got maybe 50 people that touch the family over the course of 6 months. And then you have us who are there for every step of the way.
Yeah, explaining the details, answering the questions, at a very high level view of this is where we're at, and for our family mission statement, this is where we're heading, and this is why we're doing it this way. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you explained the first step of the intervention process, which when we're talking about being different than the AE show intervention, we see a lot of families. I mean, someone's being surprised. It's a meeting. I'm inviting my loved one to come have coffee with me, and next thing you know, there's 12 family members with notes in their hands, and I'm surprised. And as we've seen on the show, it gets a little dicey sometimes. People run, people leave. But what you've explained is why the Arise process is so different. Is you're inviting the family member, can be there, including the person suffering from addiction. They're invited to be there. They know it's coming. So talk about that first step a little deeper, and then talk about the other ways that Arise is way different than the popular AE show intervention.
Yeah, I can feel that one. With the invitation, there are no surprises. It's completely transparent. The individual, the person of concern, 90% of the time shows up for that first meeting. 95%. I don't know exactly what that statistic is.
But most of the time you see, so I would say if I was a family member and I'm not educated at all, I'd be like, look, if I tell my son about it, he's never going to go there. He hasn't showed up in the past. But what you're saying is, in your experience, you see that people do show up if they follow your process.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for clarifying that. That is what happens. We just experienced it with a young man. He stayed first. Well, first he walked out. Then he came back into the house and stayed in the back edge of the room near the kitchen, and then eventually moved further in. So, and that is, if somebody is going to not show up, they eventually show up because they want to know what's happening. They want to know what's being said about them. There's just that inherent curiosity and then wanting to defend their position. And that's where we see people start to participate. Then once they see that there's no shame, blame, and guilt, that we quickly move that individual off of what they perceive as the hot seat, because we go straight into asking about family strengths, humor. Julie outlined them. And then we go into the family recovery message, where we want the family to go, not the individual, but the family as a whole. Then we jump into that genogram. And so it's storytelling. So quite often, I'd say more often than not, that individual within about a half an hour of starting to participate is laughing. It's kind of surreal. And so,
that seems surreal because, again, those aren't the things you see on the popular show Intervention. There's drama, but that's TV, and that's why they show that. But what you're saying is it's not as eventful as we see on TV.
Yeah.
Say too, Clay, like one thing that we also see is that if somebody if drama does pop up, we all stay calm. It's not like we rise to the occasion and meet somebody where they are from a heightened emotional level. At the very beginning, actually, we go around and everybody gets a buddy that if they feel like they need a timeout for 5 minutes just to collect their thoughts or have a smoke or whatever somebody's jam is, you have to go with a buddy. And we pick those. And so there's nothing going on here except for that somebody's worried about you, and we don't want your fate to be like these people that are on your family genogram. And I think it's really simple. It's like, so your grandmother killed herself, and then your aunt killed herself, and you have suicidal ideation. Is that where we want to go? And then even with the family, you ask them, how do we want to support this person differently than maybe how aunt was supported and how grandma was supported? Because that's where these little tiny tweaks in family behavior make all the difference in the world. And like, we're working with a family right now where one person was the person of concern. So this whole family gathered around, and this was at the very beginning of COVID. So we had like half the family real time in person with Clay and Courtney. And then the other half is all Zooming from around the country. We worked with them for about 4 months. And at that point in the 4-month process, one of the cousins was having some challenges. And so then the family rallied around, like, how can we support him? Because now he's in crisis. And so then we did another invitational intervention where this young man knew that we were going to surround him with love and surround him with resources. And what could he use in order to go to the next phase in recovery? And then he went into a place for mental health challenges. And now he just transitioned back home. And now we're doing recovery calls each week with that extended family network. And they've added more people to it. It's just beautiful to experience. And at first, that whole family was like, what is this thing that we're doing? So we're coming together to talk about problems, or like, do we have any?
Right.
Or challenges, I should say, not problems.
Now, however you word it is how people feel. At the end of the day, we do come to the table probably like, oh no, we're good, we're fine, and we don't, and then they start to slowly come up. And one thing you highlighted, especially with this family right now, is you're at the 4-month process and something came up. You guys typically support families through this entire process for around 6 months, right?
Mhm.
Talk about that long support, and I think you just totally highlighted why it's so important. At the 4-month mark, a problem arose. If that problem arose and you didn't have a team of people working with you, you might not be able to come together and support that person. So talk about why the 6 months is so important.
Well, yeah, I can answer that. Thanks, Danny. We do like that 6-month commitment from the family, because we do see those things arise at different intervals, and they're different coping mechanisms. Now, we as Roots Collaborative may have seen some of the challenges that were taking place for various individuals participating in those family network calls. And we put that back out to the family. We don't call things out. It's not, and I think you understand, with, the invitational intervention, it's not confrontational. It's very transparent. We're very conscientious of language being used. We're not huge fans of, now the families will use terms. We're not huge somebody is mentally ill, where somebody's a junkie, somebody's we don't like that terminology. And we start to reset the table with that, because that's not a bad person. They're just currently challenged with, some mental health challenges or some substance disorders, eating disorders. So shifting some of that language, and the reason that I'm talking about that is because now we're introducing new language, addressing certain challenges that the families are having, identifying patterns from previous generations that aren't effective. Those are very normal. That's the baseline. And so we're asking for a shift. And so we're the training wheels to help keep that shift sustainable so that there can be new patterns.
Yeah.
And that does. And so at different intervals, there'll be resistance, or they'll be stepping backwards into some less effective communication styles. And we just bring them back to center. This is where we're going. This is the family recovery message. Does what you're doing currently say that you're moving towards that? And Julie spoke eloquently about that, is that we're just, the Sherpa to recovery, as Julie, expressed. Not only is that from program to program during those vulnerable transitional periods, but it's also to keep bringing everybody back to make these new ways, these new patterns of existence with themselves and with each other have a real foundation and remain sustainable, because we're ultimately there to help that individual and the entire family have sustainable recovery. So there'll be, bounces in different directions, and we just try to keep them on that path for sustainable recovery. And, you did mention that show on A&E. The odds are not good, and we don't have those at our fingertips right now, but that show does hit a crescendo. That person goes off to treatment. The odds are pretty slim, actually, that person even completes their duration in treatment. With the ARISE model, and thank you to Dr. Judith Landau, it's evidence-based. So it's, these protocols are followed, and these are the outcomes, and it's tracked. Individuals that go through this process, the likelihood of them actually doing what they committed to at the beginning of, I'll go to treatment for 30 days, the likelihood of them staying for that is greatly increased, and then even extending their time within that structured treatment facility, and then going on to the next level of care that is being suggested from that treatment facility's professionals, they're clinicians saying, yeah, we really think you should do partial hospitalization from here, and then intensive outpatient from there, stay in a sober living community. They stay the course, because what we do know is the longer individuals are in that recovery setting, the likelihood of them having sustainable recovery is greatly increased.
Yeah, we've learned that. Keeping them involved in the process longer. This isn't a 30-day program, a 90-day program, and you're fixed. You guys are in recovery yourself. This is daily work. This is daily exercise. This is staying in tune with your sobriety. So I thought we covered a lot today. Is there anything you think we missed?
Well, I think that one thing that I would add is a lot of the philosophy that we've been talking about is, I'm wondering, if I'm a parent, I'm like, well, what does this all mean for me? And I would say the nice thing about that 6 months of working together is we are real time with real time issues. So if you think about like a topic of boundaries, so when do we give a car back to somebody? Do we pay rent for them? Do we send them back to college? What's okay for love? How do we support people? They were late last night. I mean, all of those real-time things that are happening. And then the person of concern also is like, well, my mom and dad don't trust me anymore. I've been sober 3 months. Why don't they trust me? Those are things that people bring week after week, and they get to talk through in a safe environment. And that's really, all that other stuff is amazing, and that's why it works. But some of the relief comes from being able to know that once a week you have Clay, Courtney, and Julie on this phone call, and you're allowed to say things that ordinarily are very, very challenging to say, whether it's to your mom, to your dad, to your brother, to your grandmother. Mm-hmm. And somehow on these calls, people, because we've created a safe environment, people bring their stuff and it gets worked through. And
it's amazing. When you remove the shame altogether, stuff can happen. When there's no shame, there's no guilt, there's no pinning things on people. It's amazing the type of work that can happen at that point.
Yep. And that's what's really cool is it's all the things that families don't ever want to talk about that fill up that root, right? It's like, don't talk about that. Don't bring that up. Oh, that'll make dad mad. I mean, we all have that. And, the illness untreated is a very fierce bully. It doesn't want you to bring anything up. And what we invite is let's take that bully of the illness and invite it to take a back seat and bring the humans who have real feelings and real concerns, and we can talk about it and we can validate what we see, what we hear, and what we're feeling as real. And it's amazing. So obviously you can see we're passionate about it. And it's just really refreshing to see families shift, and not just the person of concern, but the entire family is talking recovery now, which is the big differentiator in what we do versus sending someone to treatment.
Awesome. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up real quick. So if you're interested in learning more about Roots Collaborative and what they do, you can visit the website below the logo, which is rootscollaborative.com. If you're going to pick up the phone and call the number, because we know sometimes picking up this phone and reaching out is the hardest thing you'll ever do, you're going to talk to one of these people. So let's take that barrier away of you're going to get an operator or you're going to get an admissions line. This is the admissions line. You're looking at it, and you're going to talk to these human beings, and they're going to meet you where you're at with no shame, with no guilt, just there to support you through the whole process. So thanks again today for your time, Julie and Clay. We really appreciate you adding some value to any family or unit that could be afflicted by addiction right now.
Thank you, Danny.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.